life had always been steady and predictable, like the mechanism of a Swiss watch. At 32, I worked as a system administrator in a mid-sized IT company, rented a one-bedroom apartment on the 7th floor of a panel building from the 1980s, and considered myself a fairly happy person. The apartment was small, just 40 square meters, but it was enough for a single man. The kitchen was combined with the living room. The bedroom doubled as my home office, and there was a tiny hallway with a built-in wardrobe. The windows overlooked a courtyard with old poplar trees, and on summer evenings I could hear the laughter of children from the playground below. My daily routine hadn't changed in years. I woke up at 7 in the morning, had a quick breakfast of oatmeal with fruit, took a shower, and headed to work by metro. I worked from 9 to 6, sometimes staying late to fix critical server issues. My colleagues respected me for my professionalism and calm demeanor, but I didn't have close friends among them. I preferred to keep to myself, rarely attending corporate parties or joining the team for lunch. It wasn't that I was a misanthrope. I just valued solitude and quiet more than noisy gatherings. Evenings were spent at home reading technical literature or watching documentaries. I had an impressive collection of books on programming, system administration, and cybersecurity. The bookshelves took up an entire wall in my bedroom, and I was proud of my library. Sometimes I ordered takeout, pizza, or sushi, but more often, I cooked simple meals myself. Cooking was never my strong suit, but I'd learned to make a few basic dishes that kept me healthy. Weekends were dedicated to household chores and hobbies. On Saturdays, I went to the gym, not out of love for sports, but to stay in shape and maintain my health. Workouts were tough for me, but I stubbornly kept at it, understanding the importance of physical activity for someone who spends most of their day at a computer. On Sundays, I cleaned the apartment, did laundry, and bought groceries for the week at the nearby supermarket. This routine didn't weigh on me. On the contrary, it had its own charm, a rhythm that provided stability in an ever-changing world. The only break from this routine was the occasional visit to my parents, who lived in another part of the city. My mother always greeted me with a mix of care and reproach, worried that I worked too much, ate too little, and was still unmarried. My father, a retired engineer, understood my lifestyle better, but also thought I lacked social interaction. They had met in college and had been together for 35 years. So my solitary life seemed unnatural to them. I couldn't explain that I was comfortable alone, that I didn't feel the need for someone else's constant presence. I'd been renting the apartment for 4 years from an elderly woman named Antonina Ivanovna. She lived in a house outside the city with her daughter and grandchildren, renting out this apartment after her husband's passing. Antonina Ivanovna was a tactful landlord. She didn't intrude, only visited by prior arrangement, and always gave advance notice. I paid the rent on time, never had issues with utilities or property damage, and we maintained an ideal balance in our landlord-tenant relationship. The neighbors in the building were typical for such panel high-rises. Below me lived a family with 2 young children. Sometimes in the evenings, I could hear the patter of little feet and the muffled voices of parents. Above me was a solitary pensioner who loved watching TV loudly, especially news and crime reports. To the left and right were ordinary families with whom I exchanged polite greetings in the hallway, but didn't get closer. This suited me fine. I had no desire for neighborly get-togethers and preferred to keep my distance. Working in IT gave me a certain financial stability, though I wouldn't call myself wealthy. My salary covered rent, food, the gym, books, and occasional tech purchases. I didn't chase the latest gadget models, but kept up with technological advancements and upgraded my equipment as needed. At home, I had a powerful work computer, a laptop for mobile tasks, a tablet for reading, and a few old smartphones I used to test various apps. I was particularly proud of my smart home system, which I had built gradually over the past 2 years. It started with simple things, smart light bulbs and outlets. Then I added temperature and humidity sensors and a video surveillance system with 3 cameras. One camera was in the hallway, another in the living room, and the third in the bedroom. Initially, I installed them for security reasons. The neighborhood wasn't the safest, and I had expensive equipment. The system recorded video to a local server and backed it up to the cloud, and I could monitor the apartment in real time through an app on my phone. In the evenings, after returning from work, I usually stopped by the gym, which was a 10-minute walk from home. Workouts lasted an hour to an hour and a half. Basic exercises, some cardio and stretching. After the gym, I'd go home, shower, cook dinner, and sit at the computer. Sometimes I worked on personal projects, small programs or scripts that could be useful for work. Other times, I read technical documentation or watched educational videos. Before bed, I always checked the door locks, turned off all appliances except the fridge and router, and plugged in my phone to charge. I fell asleep easily. Physical exhaustion from workouts and mental fatigue from work took their toll. I rarely dreamed, and if I did, the dreams were quickly forgotten. I usually woke up a few minutes before the alarm, as if my internal clock was as precise as a machine. This life suited me completely. There was no stress from interpersonal relationships, financial troubles, or professional failures. Work brought satisfaction, the apartment was cozy, and my health was good. Sometimes my mother asked if I was bored living alone, if I wanted to start a family, or at least get a dog. I'd reply that I was comfortable, that I had the freedom to make my own choices without anyone limiting me. Deep down, I knew my lifestyle might seem dull to most people, but it suited me perfectly. The only thing that occasionally bothered me was a certain isolation from the outside world. I read the news online, but I had little real-life interaction. My colleagues were nice, but our relationship stayed professional. My parents were busy with their lives, filled with caring for my sister's children. I'd lost touch with university friends years ago. They got married, had kids, moved to other cities, or we simply drifted apart. But this didn't feel like a problem. I had learned to be self-sufficient and find joy in solitude. Everything changed in the second half of October, when the days grew noticeably shorter and the evenings became longer and darker. The first oddities began subtly, like faint ripples on water from a tossed stone. In early November, I started noticing small things that hadn't caught my attention before, but now lingered in my mind, making me pause. Returning home from work, I sometimes found that the books on my shelf weren't exactly as I'd left them in the morning. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue or carelessness. After all, I could have accidentally nudged a spine while searching for a book. Or perhaps the slight vibrations from cars passing in the courtyard shifted them by fractions of a centimeter. Work was particularly intense at the time. Our company had landed a major contract to modernize the IT infrastructure of a regional bank, and I was tasked with overseeing the server migration. This meant overtime, trips to the client's site, constant pressure, and responsibility for every minute of downtime in critical systems. I'd come home exhausted, collapse on the couch, and sometimes fall asleep in my clothes without making it to the bedroom. In the morning, I'd wake up with a stiff neck, take a quick shower, and rush back to work. In such a hectic routine, small oddities seemed perfectly natural. Of course, I could have forgotten to turn off the bathroom light or left the kitchen faucet dripping. Of course, I might not have noticed that a mug was slightly shifted from where I'd left it. A tired brain plays strange tricks, creating false memories or distorting perception. I knew this from personal experience and the occasional scientific articles I read for general knowledge, but gradually the oddities became more noticeable and inexplicable. By mid-November, I started finding traces on the fogged-up bathroom mirror. Not my own, but blurry smudges, as if someone had touched the glass with their palm. At first, I thought they were leftovers from my morning routine, but the marks appeared even when I showered in the evening and wiped the mirror dry. By morning, faint outlines of a hand or fingers would show up again on the steamed-up surface. Around November 20th, the first truly strange incident occurred. I was working late trying to set up a new backup system for the bank and didn't get home until nearly midnight. As I climbed the stairs, I heard faint tapping from my apartment, like someone walking around in slippers. The sound was rhythmic and distinct. Step, step, brief pause, step, step again. I stopped on the landing and listened. The tapping continued, then abruptly stopped. My first instinct was logical, to check if I'd left the TV or radio on. Maybe the sounds were coming from a neighbor's apartment, and the building's acoustics made it seem like they were from mine. I quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was completely silent. All devices were off, windows closed, no unusual sounds. I checked every room, tested the locks, looked in the closets. Everything was in order. I wrote it off as exhaustion and the quirks of an old building's acoustics. The next few days were calm, and I nearly forgot about the strange tapping. Work consumed all my attention and energy. The bank's server migration was reaching a critical phase where any mistake could lead to multi-million-dollar losses. I practically lived at the office, coming home only to sleep and change. I ate mostly at the office cafeteria or ordered delivery to my desk. By late November, with the project nearly complete, I finally returned to a normal work schedule. I got home at a reasonable hour, cooked dinner, and sat down to check my personal email. That's when I remembered my surveillance system and decided to review the recordings from the past few weeks. Normally, I didn't bother. The cameras ran automatically, and there was no need to check unless something suspicious happened. Opening the app, I saw dozens of hours of footage from the 3 cameras. Most of it was predictably dull. Empty rooms, occasional glimpses of me in the morning or evening, light and shadows playing across the windows. I sped up the playback, focusing only on motion. There I was, getting ready for work in the morning, coming home in the evening, reading a book on the couch. Then I saw something that made my hands go cold. On the living room camera footage, dated the night I heard the tapping, a dark figure was clearly visible. A human silhouette moved through the room with slow, deliberate steps. It was blurry, as if shrouded in mist or fog, but unmistakably human in shape. It walked from the window to the door, back to the window, paused, turned its head, and continued. I rewound the footage and watched it several times. The figure appeared in the frame around the time I was climbing the stairs and vanished minutes before I opened the door. The timestamps matched my memory of that night. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. My first thought was rational. A glitch in the recording device, a video compression artifact, or light from the courtyard street lamps. I checked the camera settings, recording quality, and network stability. Everything was functioning normally. I reviewed footage from other days. No anomalies. Only on that night, when I'd heard the steps, did the mysterious figure appear. I saved the clip to a separate drive and decided to investigate further when I was fresher and more focused. But sleep was hard that night. I lay in bed, straining to hear every sound in the apartment. The creaking of furniture from temperature changes, the hum of the fridge, the noise of cars outside. Everything felt suspicious and unsettling. A few times, I thought I heard faint footsteps in the next room, but when I got up to check, there was nothing. I only fell asleep near dawn, waking up drained and unrested. At work, I tried to find a rational explanation. I consulted a colleague who specialized in surveillance systems, describing the issue vaguely without mentioning anything supernatural. He suggested possible causes: a faulty camera sensor, interference from electrical devices, or issues with video stream encoding. He gave me a few diagnostic and video analysis tools. That evening, I spent hours analyzing the footage. The software showed no signs of file corruption, tampering, or digital artifacts. The figure was a real part of the image, not a technical glitch. This threw me completely off balance. I'm a technical person, accustomed to logical explanations and evidence. The supernatural always seemed the domain of superstitious people or sci-fi movie writers. By early December, the oddities became more frequent. I started noticing objects in the apartment moving on their own. In the morning, I'd find the TV remote on the kitchen table when I'd left it on the coffee table in the living room the night before. A book I was reading before bed would be on the floor next to the bed, though I distinctly remembered placing it on the nightstand. Keys turned up in the oddest places: the bathroom, the fridge, the bedroom windowsill. At first, I suspected something was wrong with me. Maybe work stress was affecting my memory and focus. Maybe I was showing early signs of a neurological issue. I started documenting where I left important items, photographing the placement of objects on tables and shelves, but the notes only confirmed that things were indeed moving. The sounds were especially troubling. I began hearing them regularly: faint footsteps, creaking floorboards, rustling like someone flipping through papers or books. The noises always came from another room when I was in one. If I went to check, silence fell. But as soon as I returned, the sounds resumed. I systematically reviewed the surveillance footage. The mysterious figure was appearing more often. Sometimes it just stood motionless in a corner of the room, silent and still. Other times, it slowly moved between furniture. Once, I saw it lean over my desk, as if examining documents or my computer screen. The most unsettling part was that the figure only appeared when I wasn't home or was asleep. It never showed itself when I was awake and in the same room, as if it knew I was there and deliberately avoided contact. This made me think it wasn't random or a technical glitch, but something intentional and aware. By mid-December, I could no longer ignore it. The figure was becoming clearer and more active. In the latest recordings, I could make out details. It was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see the face, but the proportions and movements clearly belonged to an adult. Whether male or female, I couldn't tell. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone had broken into the apartment with the duplicate key. Maybe a neighbor had somehow gained access. I changed the locks and installed additional motion sensors, but it didn't help. The figure kept appearing, as if locks and sensors didn't exist for it. The scariest incident happened on the night of December 18th. I woke up around 3 in the morning with a distinct feeling that someone was watching me. It was a physical sensation: goosebumps, tension in the back of my neck, an instinctive dread that defied logic. I lay still, listening to the silence, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard breathing. Quiet, steady, definitely not mine. It came from the corner of the bedroom where my armchair and floor lamp stood. Straining my ears, I caught a faint whistle on the inhale, the kind of sound someone with a stuffy nose or breathing issues might make. The sound was unmistakable. Someone in my bedroom was breathing. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it could be heard throughout the building. I slowly turned my head toward the corner but couldn't make anything out in the dark. Just vague outlines of furniture and a darker patch where the armchair should be. The breathing continued, steady and calm, as if someone was sitting in the chair, patiently waiting. I lay there for several minutes, too scared to move. Then I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand, where the flashlight was. My fingers trembled so much I could barely grasp it and turn on the light. The bright beam cut through the darkness and lit up the corner of the room. The armchair was empty. No one was there. But I'd heard the breathing right up until the moment I turned on the light. It stopped instantly, as if someone had held their breath or simply vanished. I scanned the entire room with the light. It was completely empty. Just me, the bed, the furniture, and an oppressive silence. After that night, sleep eluded me for a long time. I lay in bed until dawn, listening to every sound, staring at every shadow. Every creak of the floorboards, every crackle of the furniture made me flinch and tense up. By morning, I looked as if I hadn't slept in a week. Red eyes, pale face, trembling hands. At work, colleagues started asking if I was okay, if I was sick. I brushed it off, saying I was just overworked and would soon take a vacation. But a vacation was impossible. The bank project was entering its final stage, and my presence was critical. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to what was happening in my apartment. During the day, under the office lights, amid the familiar bustle and hum of computers, it all seemed unreal. Like a nightmare or hallucination. But as soon as I returned home, the anxiety washed over me again. I started avoiding the apartment. After work, I'd go to 24-hour cafes, wander through shopping malls, or sit in the library until it closed. I only returned home when I had nowhere else to go, trying to fall asleep as quickly as possible to avoid the strange sounds. But even sleep brought no peace. I had nightmares, dark figures standing by my bed watching me sleep. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, unable to tell if it was a dream or reality. The surveillance camera footage grew increasingly unsettling. The figure appeared almost every night, and its behavior was changing. Before, it merely walked through the rooms or stood still. But now it showed interest in my personal belongings. I saw it leaning over my desk, rifling through papers, opening drawers. One recording showed it standing by the bookshelf, seemingly reading the titles on the spines, slowly turning its head from left to right. The most terrifying part was that it started approaching the bedroom. It used to stay in the living room and hallway, but now I noticed it in the bedroom doorway. It stood there motionless, and though I couldn't make out its face, I had the distinct feeling it was watching me sleep, vulnerable and unaware. I tried seeking professional help. First, I visited a doctor, explaining my sleep issues and stress. The therapist prescribed mild sedatives and recommended seeing a psychologist. I followed the advice but couldn't tell the psychologist the whole truth. How do you explain to an educated person that your apartment is haunted by a ghost or something even stranger? So I talked about work stress, insomnia, and anxiety. The psychologist gave practical advice on managing stress, but it couldn't address my real problem. In late December, I took a desperate step. I asked an old university friend, Maxime, whom I hadn't seen in years, if I could stay at his place for a few days. I said my apartment had heating issues that needed fixing. Maxime agreed without prying. He'd known me for years and understood I wouldn't ask for help without a serious reason. The 3 days at Maxime's were a breath of fresh air. I slept normally, ate with appetite, and could focus on work. No strange sounds, no moving objects, no mysterious figures. I almost convinced myself the problem was in my head, that stress and exhaustion had caused hallucinations. Maybe I'd been battling my own imagination all along, but when I returned to my apartment, it all started again. Worse, my brief absence seemed to have intensified the unseen presence's activity. The first night back, I woke to the sound of books falling. Turning on the light, I found several volumes scattered on the floor, fanned out with pages open at random. The books couldn't have fallen on their own. The shelf was sturdy, and they were packed tightly. In the morning, I reviewed the camera footage from my absence. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The figure appeared every night, but its behavior was different. It wasn't just wandering. It was searching for something. It opened cabinets, pulled out drawers, rummaged through my things. One recording showed it standing before the bathroom mirror, and though no reflection was visible, it seemed to be studying itself. The most terrifying footage was from the last night before my return. The figure entered the bedroom and sat on my bed. It actually sat. The mattress dipped under an invisible weight. The blanket crumpled. It sat there for nearly an hour, motionless, as if waiting for me to return. At times, it turned its head toward the door, as if listening for sounds in the hallway. After that, I knew I was dealing with something beyond ordinary experience. This wasn't a hallucination, a technical glitch, or a prank. Something was in my apartment that didn't belong. Something with consciousness, will, and an apparent interest in me. I started researching the history of the building and the apartment. I visited the archives, spoke with the property management company, and questioned neighbors. The building was constructed in 1982, and my apartment had belonged to the Gromov family. Vasily Gromov was a factory engineer, his wife Maria, a school teacher. They had a teenage daughter and lived quietly, with no issues with neighbors. Everything changed in 1995. Vasily lost his job during the economic crisis and began drinking heavily. The family fell apart. His wife and daughter moved to relatives, leaving him alone. Neighbors said he became strange and reclusive, rarely leaving the apartment. He'd talk to someone, though he lived alone. Sometimes, screams and furniture noises were heard at night. In 2001, Vasily Gromov died in the apartment. His body was found only a week later when neighbors noticed a smell. The official cause of death was heart failure due to alcoholism. The apartment sat empty for years before Antonina Ivanovna bought it and began renting it out. Over the years, several tenants came and went, but none stayed long. Antonina Ivanovna attributed this to high rent or personality clashes. Learning this history, I realized I might be dealing with Vasily Gromov's spirit. It explained why the presence was tied to this apartment, why it showed interest in my belongings, and why it avoided direct contact. Perhaps the spirit of the former owner couldn't leave the place where he spent his final years, dying alone in despair. I researched how to handle such phenomena, reading dozens of online articles, forums for people encountering the paranormal, and books on ghosts. Most sources suggested trying to communicate with the spirit, finding out what it wanted, or hiring a professional to banish it. As a skeptic, the idea of an exorcist seemed absurd. Instead, I tried a rational approach. If the spirit was Vasily Gromov, perhaps it just wanted acknowledgement, I began speaking to the empty apartment, addressing the unseen presence. I said I knew it was there, meant no harm, and was willing to coexist peacefully. For the first few days, nothing changed. The figure still appeared on recordings, objects moved, and sounds persisted. But gradually the activity became less aggressive. Books stopped falling, loud noises ceased. The presence seemed to listen to my words, trying to understand my intentions. The turning point came on New Year's Eve. I stayed home alone, skipping the office party and not celebrating with friends. I sat in the living room, reading, occasionally glancing at the clock. At midnight, the TV showed fireworks, and I heard a soft knock on the wall. 3 times, a pause, then 3 more. It was clearly a signal, an attempt to get my attention. I put down my book and said aloud, "Vasily Petrovich, if that's you, I hear you. I know you're here, and I don't want to disturb you. This was your apartment, and I understand it's hard for you to leave." The knocking repeated, 3 times, a pause, 3 more. Then silence fell, not threatening but almost friendly. From that moment, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. I still heard sounds and saw the figure on recordings, but they no longer frightened me. It felt like having a roommate in a shared apartment, someone who lives alongside you but doesn't interfere. Objects stopped moving and the mirror no longer showed mysterious prints. But in mid-January, this fragile harmony was shattered. I caught the flu and spent several days bedridden with a high fever. In my delirium, I felt someone caring for me, bringing water, adjusting my blanket, placing a cool hand on my forehead. When the fever broke, I assumed these were hallucinations typical of illness. But reviewing the camera footage from those days, I saw something shocking. The figure approached my bed, leaned over me, and reached toward my forehead. One recording showed it picking up a glass from the nightstand, bringing it to my lips, then placing it back. It looked like Vasily Gromov's spirit was caring for me during my illness, as a living person might. This discovery shook me to my core. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a residual presence, but something more complex and terrifying. The spirit not only acknowledged me, but showed emotional attachment. It didn't want to harm me. It wanted to help, protect, and care for me. But this care became increasingly intrusive. The spirit started meddling in my daily life. If I forgot to turn off the stove, the gas would mysteriously shut off. If I fell asleep at the computer, it would go into sleep mode. If I came home drunk after meeting friends, I'd find a glass of water and painkillers on the table in the morning. At first, this seemed touching, but gradually I felt under constant surveillance. The spirit watched my every move, anticipating my needs before I did. It was like living under a microscope, where my private life was no longer mine. By February, the situation became critical. The spirit grew jealous of my outside world. When I stayed late at work, I'd return to an atmosphere of displeasure, slamming doors, flickering lights, moving furniture. If I visited friends or family, I'd come back to a chaotic apartment, as if someone had rampaged through it in anger. The breaking point came with a girl I met at the gym. Lena, a fitness instructor, was vibrant, cheerful, and perfectly normal. We went to the movies and cafes a few times, and I invited her over for dinner. An attempt to reclaim a normal life, forget the apartment's strangeness, and start building a relationship. The dinner went wonderfully. Lena admired my apartment, especially the smart home system and book collection. We talked about work, travel, and future plans. For the first time in months, I felt happy and almost forgot about my invisible roommate. But when we moved to the living room and sat on the couch, things turned strange. First, the lights went out. I explained it as an electrical issue and lit candles. Then books started falling off the shelves, one at first, then several more. Lena laughed nervously, saying old buildings can be quirky. But when a cabinet door slammed open and the sound of breaking dishes came from the kitchen, she was genuinely scared. I tried to calm her, blaming it on the building, but it was too late. Lena grabbed her things and left, saying she had urgent matters. She never called me again and avoided me at the gym. I realized Vasily Gromov's spirit wouldn't tolerate another person in his apartment, especially a woman. After that incident, I knew the situation was out of control. The spirit was no longer just a roommate, but a jailer, preventing me from living a full life. Its care had turned into obsession, its attachment into a toxic dependency. I understood I had to act before I lost all connection to the outside world. March became the month of my final descent into an abyss from which there was no return. After the failed evening with Lena, the spirit of Vasily Gromov seemed to sense its power over me and began asserting it more openly and aggressively. It no longer merely observed my life. It controlled it, bending my existence to its dead desires and needs. Every morning I woke with the feeling that someone had stood by my bed all night watching me sleep. The camera footage confirmed this. The dark figure lingered at my bedside for hours, motionless as a statue. Sometimes it leaned closer, and I could almost feel cold breath on my face. I woke up exhausted, broken, as if I'd been wrestling an unseen opponent all night. The spirit began interfering with my work. When I tried to focus on projects, my computer glitched in bizarre ways. Programs closed on their own, files vanished, and the keyboard typed random characters. Colleagues noticed my productivity plummeting, commenting on my haggard and distracted appearance. Management started expressing dissatisfaction with my work. In early March, an incident shattered my reputation at the company. I'd prepared a presentation for a key client, working on it for days, meticulously checking every slide. But during the presentation, the file was corrupted. Instead of charts and graphs, the screen displayed distorted images, and the text turned into unreadable symbols. The client left unhappy, management berated me, and I couldn't explain what had happened. At home, things grew worse. The spirit no longer limited itself to silent observation. It actively demonstrated its presence. Objects flew through the air, doors slammed shut, and rusty-colored water dripped from faucets. At night, I heard not only footsteps but voices, a faint whisper emanating from the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was anxious, almost pleading. The surveillance camera footage became even more disturbing. The spirit's figure grew clearer and more detailed. I could now make out its face, gaunt, with sunken cheeks and empty eye sockets. Its clothes hung in tatters, and its movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Most terrifyingly, it began looking directly into the cameras, as if it knew I was watching and wanted to make eye contact. I tried to leave the apartment and find new housing, but the spirit wouldn't let me. Every attempt to view a new place ended in strange incidents. Sudden panic attacks, inexplicable injuries like falls, cuts, or bruises. One realtor refused to work with me after his nose started bleeding for no reason during a viewing, and the hallway mirror cracked in a spiderweb pattern. I gradually realized a horrifying truth. The spirit of Vasily Gromov had bound me to this place as tightly as it was bound after death. We became hostages to each other, chained by invisible bonds of despair and loneliness. It couldn't leave the apartment where it died, and now I couldn't leave either, trapped in its dead world. My parents grew worried about my condition. My mother visited several times, but her visits always ended in chaos. The spirit clearly didn't tolerate others in the apartment, especially those dear to me. When she was in the living room, poltergeist activity erupted. Paintings fell, light bulbs burst, strange noises came from the walls. She urged me to see a psychiatrist, insisting something was seriously wrong. But I couldn't tell her the truth. My father was more pragmatic. He suggested I move in with them temporarily to recover. But when I tried to pack, the spirit went into a frenzy. My suitcase unzipped itself, clothes scattered across the room, and the front door's lock jammed so I couldn't open it. After hours of futile attempts, I gave up and stayed. In April, I lost my job. The official reason was failure to meet job requirements, but I knew the real cause. My behavior had become too erratic, my performance had tanked, and colleagues complained about inexplicable technical issues around me. Management tolerated it for months, but finally let me go. Losing my job was the final straw in my slow descent into madness. With no reason to leave the apartment, no social contacts, and no purpose, I spent days and a half days listening to whispers from the walls and watching my invisible neighbor. The spirit seemed pleased with this state of affairs. Its activity lessened, but its presence became constant and intrusive. My savings dwindled at an alarming rate. Rent, utilities, and food drained my funds, and I had no income. I applied for jobs and attended interviews, but each attempt failed in the same pattern. During interviews, I'd experience tremors, memory lapses, or uncontrollable bursts of aggression. Employers saw me as unstable and rejected me. By May, my mental state was critical. I barely slept, ate irregularly, and neglected hygiene. The mirror showed a gaunt man with inflamed eyes, an unkempt beard, and trembling hands. I talked to myself, or rather, to Vasily Gromov's spirit, my only companion in this world. Our conversations were one-sided. I spoke aloud, and he responded with moving objects, temperature changes, or sounds from the walls. We developed a crude communication system. 1 knock meant yes, 2 meant no, 3 meant I don't know. A slamming door signaled displeasure, flickering lights agreement, and cold air sadness or longing. Through this system, I learned more about Vasily Gromov and his attachment to the apartment. He had died here in utter loneliness, abandoned by family and friends. His final years were spent in isolation, talking only to himself, slowly losing touch with reality. Death didn't free him from this loneliness. It intensified it to an unbearable degree. He saw a kindred spirit in me, another loner who valued solitude over society. But his dead love was destructive, like the suffocating embrace of a drowning man. He wanted me to stay with him forever, to become part of his ghostly existence, to share his eternal loneliness. In June, an event broke my will to resist. Antonina Ivanovna, the apartment's owner, came for an unscheduled visit. She hadn't heard from me in weeks and was worried about the apartment's condition. When she opened the door with her keys and saw me, she was horrified. I looked like a homeless man, dirty, unshaven, in tattered clothes. The apartment was a wreck, trash everywhere, unwashed dishes piling up, a stale smell in the air. She demanded explanations, threatened eviction, and mentioned calling the police or an ambulance. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the familiar phenomena began. Cabinet doors slammed, invisible balls rolled across the floor, and the temperature plummeted. Antonina Ivanovna paled, muttered something about a cursed place, and fled. An hour later, I received a message demanding I vacate the apartment within a week, but I couldn't leave physically. The spirit wouldn't let me near the front door with the intent to escape. Each step toward the hallway brought suffocation, dizziness, or sharp chest pain. I realized I was as much a prisoner of this place as Vasily Gromov had been. July marked my final surrender. I stopped fighting, accepted my fate, and embraced my role as the eternal companion of a dead man. We lived in a strange symbiosis. I read aloud books he chose, rearranged furniture to his liking, cooked food he couldn't eat but whose remembered taste pleased him. The camera footage captured our shared life in detail. I spoke to empty air, set the table for two, and left half the food on an untouched plate. To an outsider, it looks like a textbook case of severe mental illness, but I knew the truth. I was living with a ghost who had become more real to me than the living. By early August, my money ran out. Electricity was cut off for non-payment, then gas, then water. But the spirit found ways around these obstacles. Light bulbs glowed without power, fueled by some unknown energy. Water flowed from faucets despite being disconnected. Food appeared in the fridge, though I hadn't shopped in weeks. I realized I was living in a warped space where the laws of physics no longer applied. A pocket of the afterlife amidst a living city. The apartment had become an island of death, and I was a bridge between worlds, a medium through which Vasily Gromov's spirit maintained a connection to the material realm. In September, my parents came. They rang the doorbell, shouted my name, and threatened to call a locksmith. But the door wouldn't open. The lock was jammed so tightly no key could turn it. After hours, they left, and I heard my mother crying in the stairwell. Those were the last sounds of the living world I heard. Time lost all meaning after that. Days merged into an endless twilight where sleep and wakefulness, reality and hallucination, blurred. I spent hours in an armchair staring at one spot, while Vasily Gromov's spirit told me his life story through creaks, knocks, and rustles. Gradually, I began seeing him without the cameras, first as blurry shapes in my peripheral vision, then clearer silhouettes, and finally a vivid image of a gaunt, middle-aged man in tattered clothes. He sat across from me in another chair, staring with empty eye sockets, his lips moving in silent words. My body began to change. I lost weight, weakened, my skin took on a sickly gray hue. My hair fell out in clumps, my teeth loosened, my nails turned brittle and yellow. I was becoming a living corpse, a mirror image of the spirit draining my life force. But the most terrifying changes were in my mind. Memories of my past life faded like files on a corrupted hard drive. I forgot friends' names, colleagues' faces, even my parents' voices. All that remained were fragments, images, emotions, sensations too disjointed to form a coherent narrative. In their place, foreign memories emerged. Vasily Gromov's childhood, his youth, his factory job, meeting his future wife. I remembered the taste of her first kiss, the scent of her hair, the feel of his daughter's small hand in mine. But these memories were steeped in the bitterness of loss and loneliness. By October, the boundary between me and the spirit dissolved. We became one being with two consciousnesses, two sets of memories, two souls trapped in a dying body. I spoke with his voice, thought his thoughts, felt his emotions. But he also began recalling my life, my work, my parents. The camera footage from this period showed a horrifying picture. I sat motionless in the armchair for hours, occasionally turning my head or moving my lips. Sometimes, Vasily Gromov's ghostly silhouette appeared beside me, and we seemed to hold a silent conversation. Our movements grew more synchronized, our expressions more alike. In November, an event I initially took for a hallucination occurred. I saw myself, or rather, The version of me from when I first moved into the apartment. A young, healthy, vibrant programmer, unaware of the horror awaiting him within these walls. He stood in the bedroom doorway, staring at me with horror and disgust. He said something about this not being real, that he wouldn't let himself become such a monster. But I knew his protests were futile. Time here looped, events repeated, and fate was sealed the moment I crossed the apartment's threshold. December brought the realization of the inevitable end. My body could no longer sustain two consciousnesses, two souls in one shell. My heart beat slower. My breathing grew shallow. My vision blurred. I was dying, but death didn't scare me. It felt like liberation from the torment of existing between life and death. In my final days, I lay in bed, listening as Vasily Gromov's spirit spoke of what awaited after death. He said we'd stay together forever, becoming one entity, one shadow bound to this place. We'd wait for the next tenant to repeat my path and join our dead brotherhood. The cameras captured my death. I lay on the bed, eyes open but unseeing. Beside me stood Vasily Gromov's ghost, no longer frightening. We looked at each other, and in his empty eye sockets I saw my soul's reflection. The final recording showed an empty apartment, its lights slowly fading one by one. But if you looked closely, two dark figures stood in the corners, waiting patiently, waiting for a new tenant, a new lonely soul to become the next link in a chain of cursed spirits. A week later, Antonina Ivanovna found my body. The official cause of death was exhaustion due to depression and starvation. The apartment was put up for rent again, and as before, no tenants stayed long. But I knew someone would eventually stay. A lonely, reclusive person seeking peace in these quiet walls. And we would welcome them with open arms, as Vasily Gromov's spirit once welcomed me. Because death isn't the end. It's the beginning of eternal loneliness, to be shared with other lost souls. Welcome to our home. There's always room for one more.